up, theology nerds? This is Trip, and you're listening to Homebrewed Christianity. That's right. For over 12 years, we've been bringing you ideological goodness. That's right, podcast episodes. For your earbuds, so you can think through life's biggest questions with some of the greatest scholars, philosophers, theologians, scientists, and today, a homiletician. That's right, Dr. Leah Schade is on the podcast, professor of preaching and worship at Lexington Theological Seminary. She's pretty awesome, and we're going to talk about all sorts of goodness, not just preaching, but what is it like to do it in the middle of a crisis? And this isn't new to her. In fact, she's tackled difficult topics in preaching. Her newest book, Preaching in the Purple Zone, Ministry in the Blue-Red Divide, is one example, but also Creation Crisis, Preaching, Ecology, and Theology in the Pulpit. That's a dangerous topic, if I do say so myself. So Dr. Leah Schade, Lexington Theological Seminary, is on the podcast, and we're going to have ourselves a good old conversation. Before we jump in, I want to tell you a few things. First, over 1,000 people are in our online class currently. Over 1,000 people have joined the Process and Reality class with John Cobb, and we're having a good old time. And if you haven't joined it yet, you should totally come, because over 1,000 people are reading Alfred North Whitehead's Process and Reality with the most epic and zesty guide that is John Cobb himself. 95-year-old philosopher and theologian extraordinaire, the greatest living interpreter of Alfred North Whitehead, is guiding us through this philosophical masterpiece. And for many of you, you're self-isolating. You're sitting inside. Why not carpe diem that philosophical text? Go to processandreality.com and join up. Second, I just want to let everybody know that on the horizon, the next big class we're going to be doing is going to be on Bonhoeffer. Oh yeah? It's been requested among the Homebrewed community members. They said, let's do it. I've got a friend. Well, you'll find out more soon. But Dietrich Bonhoeffer is the next big class that's on the way. And I say that because now might be the perfect time. Might be the perfect time for you to join the Homebrewed community. Because of the crisis, because people have been losing their jobs and such, we lost about 40 members' financial contributions. But no one has, been kicked out of anything or withheld anything. I want anyone and everyone who's interested in the benefits of being part of the Homebrewed community while isolating, or those in the health, pharmacy areas serving. I want all of them to have access to all the goods. So, everybody who has emailed me about losing their jobs, know your account's still active and all the content and everything's still available. The private podcast feed still works. You'll be added to any of the groups and stuff without any effort, all that kind of thing. If you are one of those people who income and stuff isn't affected by this, and you've always thought about sponsoring, it'd be really good. Between losing members' financial support and all the speaking invitations that have disappeared or hopefully will be rescheduled, I hope, for the next 6 months, that dramatically shifted my family's income a little over $20,000. So, yeah, if you are thinking about joining, this would be a great time to join. If you're stuck at home and want to join and are financially strapped, you should just email me. Honestly, if you want to theologize and nerd out extra, then just let me know, because we're all in this together. We don't know exactly how it's going to play out and how it's going to go. But if you have a chance to have more nerdy content for your earbuds, then join the group. You'll meet some people. We'll interact. We've done some live Zoom happy hour. That was fun, of Homebrewed members. So yeah, just email me, join up and all that kind of good stuff. So just go to homebrewedcommunity.com. That's all you have to do if you want to join up, homebrewedcommunity.com. If you want to holler at me, then just email me, trip@homebrewedcommunity.com. Lastly, If you are a minister at a church doing a lot of stuff online and would like for me to join some way digitally for whatever, like I'm going to be doing some preaching through Zoom. I'll be doing visiting some small groups, some pub groups digitally. I'm doing one leadership training, like a bunch of their lay leaders at Theology Academy online. I'm trying to come up with other options since we're all trying to figure out what this space looks like. So if there's something you have an idea for me joining you, then email me, trip@homebrewedchristianity.com. Join the community, homebrewedcommunity.com. And now get your theological and homiletical safety belt ready, because Leah Schade is on the podcast from Lexington Theological Seminary, who is also the sponsor of this episode. Thank you, Lexington Theological Seminary. They've been around for over 150 years, and they specialize in online and intensive interaction, and you'll hear about how they actually utilize the community and space you're in for theological reflection. It's pretty fascinating and exciting. Plus, after you hear from Dr. Schade, I think you'll get the vibe of just what Lexington Theological Seminary is up to. You can check them out, lextheo.edu, Lex, like L-E-X, Theo, short for God in Greek, .edu, and find out about all that they are up to. Links will be on the website. Alrighty. Enjoy. Hello, Homebrewed Christianity listeners. This is Tripp, and Leah Schade is here on the podcast from Lexington Theological Seminary, who is simultaneously the sponsor of this episode. So it's time to buckle your theological safety belts, but not just any of them, the homiletical ones, because Dr. Schade is a homiletician.
That's right.
Of a higher order.
Preaching. Yeah.
Oh, yeah.
Yeah, I don't know how high it is or if it's very ordered, but I definitely teach preaching.
Mm-hmm. And so here's a question. For people that are, I've got a number of people that have messaged me since Wilson was on and asking about the D-Min program and asking about the use of online education. Now that so many schools, because of the coronavirus, are going to online, like what have you learned about the potential and the power of doing online education after you learn to become more familiar with it?
Yeah, in some ways, we are well positioned for this particular moment in our culture and in our world, because everybody is trying to do what we've been doing for, the past 10 years, which is to primarily be an online platform. Our students only come to us for intensives in January and June, and everything else is synchronous or asynchronous online learning. Synchronous means that you're talking to your students in real time, like through Zoom. Mm-hmm. Asynchronous means that it's text-based. So people are coming onto discussion boards at different times of the day and or different times of the week, and it's much less linear in that sense. So one thing that I do want to give a word of caution to anybody who's trying to do this for the first time is not to set your expectations too high for this sort of emergency moving online. Mm-hmm. It's a very, very different pedagogical format to do what you would normally do in an in-person classroom, and to try to do it either through, GoToMeeting or FaceTiming or Zoom. This is not to say that the quality of the platform is any less than in person. It's just really, really different. And so, especially as, we're in the second half of the semester for those who are on a semester-based system, don't be too hard on yourself. Don't try to think that you have to get all the bells and whistles and all of a sudden create fancy PowerPoints and do all of this. Just try to get to the basics that you need your students to know, and to also do it in a very compassionate way, recognizing that at least at our seminary, our students, even though we're already online, and so it's not a high learning curve, what we're finding is that because our curriculum is very much congregationally based, which means that they have to do their assignments in conjunction with what they're doing in their churches. Now, when their churches aren't meeting or worship is suspended, how are they supposed to preach in their congregation for their practice preaching assignment? How are they supposed to teach a Bible study when there's no Bible study that's happening? So we have to sort of lower the bar and understand that students are trying to juggle having their kids at home, trying to figure out, well, what do I do? How do I put worship online? And how do I get my congregants who are older and may not have either good internet connection or even know how to set it up at all? I mean, this is a huge learning curve for everyone. So keep it basic, keep it really simple, and maintain the human connections. I think that is what's really important in this, and figure out what is the lowest common denominator that I need my students to know in order to pass this class. And then once you've had to get your feet wet with it, then you can say, okay, this was really interesting. How might I use this platform going forward to enhance my learning after the crisis is over?
Mm-hmm. No, that's really helpful. And also, I found when doing online classes, the power of the class doesn't correlate to the competency of the teacher's use of the technology, right? Like some of the best people at doing online classes are not the ones that know how to use every little trick and tool. It's those that have figured out how through that medium to really get the student to wrestle with the content.
Exactly. One of the things that's really important in an online format is constant communication. So to be checking in, to be repetitive in the instructions on what they're supposed to do. It's better to have too much information than to have too little and be floundering around. It's really helpful to know exactly step 1, this, step 2, this. How many words do you want me to write? Hey, give me the very clear delineations of what I'm supposed to do here, so that I don't have to worry about the process that's already taken care of for me. I can then think about the content. So, for example, I might say in a class that I'm teaching on Introduction to Worship, I have the students do a video do a video tour of their sanctuary. And they can just do this with their iPhone or their, whatever their handheld device is. And they have to show us, okay, where is the nave? Where is the font? Where is so they have to use the terms that they learned through the readings to describe what they're seeing. And then they post this on the discussion board. Their peers get to watch each other's videos, and they're only 7 to 9 minutes. And then I ask them in their responses to each other, what do you notice that really stands out for you in terms of the artwork, in terms of the liturgical space, and what would you like to see differently in this space? What would you change if you had a magic wand to, make the choir space bigger, or to make the pulpit movable, or whatever it is? And the beauty of this is they get to see a variety of different worship spaces that they would not be able to do in an in-person setting. So in some ways, online education is actually helpful for our students because they're getting exposure to a lot of different ideas and contexts that they wouldn't normally have in a sort of sterile laboratory of a classroom.
No, that makes sense. And I think there's ministers are so often, I don't know, like a jack of a million different trades, right? Like you go to graduate school, but you take classes that would be in 5 different master's degrees if you just did one of them. And then you go to a congregation, and each congregation has your job description and then the unwritten job description that often includes the ability to use technology, connect with people 60 years age apart, and somehow show up on everyone's best and worst day and be perfectly capable of communicating the sacred. And so, there's this the academy itself doesn't always enable you to what it asks of you for a class doesn't always correlate to each of the skills and gifts that are needed in serving congregations or nonprofits and such. And I found when doing online classes, you're able to incorporate and value people's gifts in some of those other areas that don't always compute if it involves getting in a room and engaging a particular text and doing presentations on text.
Exactly. We put a lot of expectations on pastors and expect them to be the sort of the superheroes of the church world and to do all things for all people. And then we sometimes get angry when they don't have the gifts that we think that they should have. Whereas if we were in say a corporate setting, we would not expect the person who is in the in a middle management position to be emptying the trash, fixing the toilets, making the coffee, setting up the room for the meeting, having time to do the study for the Bible session, and then following up with everybody who is sick in the workplace, right? So, but this is what we expect of pastors in this setting. So, and I'm not saying that pastors aren't capable of doing this. What I'm saying is that I think sometimes it's helpful if we can be a little more grace-filled towards clergy and understand that the things that go on behind the scenes that parishioners do not see when they're there just for, say, Sunday worship and maybe a meeting during the week. There's so much that pastors do that go unseen, balancing, trying to walk the line between people of different political persuasions and not be offensive to people, but also preach the gospel in a prophetic way. It's a huge balancing act, and pastors often feel an inordinate amount of stress trying to meet very high expectations and even their own expectations. Most pastors are often their own worst critics. They are good people with pastoral hearts that want to do a really good job. And when somebody does get angry or criticizes in some way, it's hard not to take that personally because we put all of ourselves into this ministry. And so I like to encourage my students who are in ministry to be graceful towards yourself. And when I interact with parishioners, to say, be grace-filled for your pastor. They're doing a tremendous amount of work and trying to serve God in a precarious time. So cut them a little slack.
So in your own life, when was it that the sermon became something you not only felt like called and gifted to deliver, but something you wanted to study and learn how to invite people into that craft of communication?
I've been interested in communication actually from the time I was a young person. My dad was involved with the Toastmasters, which is a speech club. So he was very much involved in my own life in teaching me how to find an effective way to communicate to people. And so, I didn't know it then, but he was planting seeds in me from a very early age in thinking about, like, how do you get people's attention? What's the hook to get them want to listen to you? How do you get them to stay with you as you are explaining a complex topic? How do you give them the little surprise here and there to stay, how they stay with you along the way? How do you end a sermon that makes it feel like, yes, it all came together. I feel satisfied. The loose ends were tied up. I may have some questions going forward, but it feels like, yes, that was a good sermon. I've been fascinated with that for a long time. And also the church where I grew up, they let us do sermons during Youth Sunday. And I think I preached my first sermon when I was probably 12. And I'll never forget it. I did a sermon on insignificance and how sometimes we think that we're insignificant, but in fact, God sees us as part of the larger work of the kingdom that we might not always anticipate. And I was fascinated by Ray Bradbury at the time, still am. I love his work. And his story, A Sound of Thunder, where a single butterfly killed, millions of years ago, has an effect on the timeline of history. And then I also talked about, I'm a harpist, and often the harp doesn't have a huge part and doesn't play all the time. But if that flourish isn't there, if you don't play your part, that affects the entire piece. So everybody's part in the orchestra is important. And I was encouraged by my pastors growing up, by my father. And then my mother is also an entertainer. She's a singer. And so she talked with me about stage presence and how to carry yourself and how to look at people when you're delivering your sermon and just create that connection. So once I became a pastor and realized how much I love teaching and preaching, I realized pretty early on that this is something that I wanted to go on and get my PhD and then be able to teach other people to do this as well.
It sounds like you had a lot of support and encouragement and affirmation from all around you, from your faith community, through your family and stuff. For those of us who are parents and mentors who want to make sure we do a good job doing that, for especially younger females who maybe experience less support and encouragement when it comes to called to be leadership, to be up front speaking, or to be called to the pulpit and such. What have you learned in hearing different stories of leaders through theological education that we could learn from?
One of the things that's important for potential ministry students who happen to be female is to take them seriously, honor their voice, and give them opportunities to exercise that voice in a public way. So when I would teach confirmation, when I was still a pastor, I would encourage all of the students, but especially the females, to say, look, I would love to see you read the lesson in church, and you're going to do this, and I'm going to coach you in this, and to see, even if they don't become pastors, because not everybody does, but to see that the church honors who they are and honors what they have to say, their thoughts, their ruminations, their theological reflections, and the gifts that they have for the church is huge. Because then they get this implicitly says that your church values who you are, which means that God values who you are. Not that, if a female has a bad experience in a church where they get the opposite message, it doesn't mean that they won't ever find their way to ministry, because there are many females who do find their way to ministry after having overcome huge hurdles, theologically, ecclesiologically, and that sort of thing. But why put up barriers when we don't have to? Let's make this as welcoming and open and inviting to our young female leaders as possible. Because why would we want to waste the gifts of half the population who could be serving the church at a time when the church is going to be in desperate need of leaders going forward? And it would be silly to cut off those who do not fit the straight white male paradigm of old. We need to be encouraging all of those people who have been marginalized and finding ways to lift them up and honor their gifts.
Mm-hmm. Definitely. And so when you think theologically about proclamation and preaching, what are some advice you give to people that maybe haven't thought about that task theologically, to start to wrestle with it and understand just what's going on in preaching?
That's a great question, because I'm actually working on a sermon workbook right now with two of my colleagues at Lexington. Jerry Sumney is our biblical professor, and Emily Askew is our theology professor. And the way we teach preaching at Lexington is that all three of us have a hand in this process somewhere along the way. So we're writing a book together that looks at the biblical, theological, and homiletical aspects to sermon preparation. And one of the things that Emily and I do in our class on theology of sermons is to help people, first of all, understand what is a theological claim. How do we do God talk in our sermons? What are we saying about who God is and what God does in the text, in the scripture, and in our congregations and in the world? How are we articulating that? And so one of the things that one of the exercises I have them do is to think about writing three statements: the central question, the central claim, and the central purpose. So the central question is, why are we having to think about this particular text? What is going on here that compels us to preach this sermon at this time to this particular group of people? And so that gives us the exigency of here's why we have to do this. And then the central claim is, what is this sermon going to say about God and about God's relationship with God's people and the world at this particular time in this particular congregation? What is the central claim? What's the message, the theological claim that you want to make? And then the central purpose is, what do you want this sermon to do? How do you want people to feel, to respond, to act as a result of hearing this sermon? So this is drawn from Tom Long's focus and function statement. It's an expansion of his work, but it helps students to really think about the core pieces that are needed for a sermon before they just start going off and like, oh, I think I found a good story. I think this talks about forgiveness, and I'll just throw this in here. And oh, I remember reading something from this theologian. I'll throw this in here, but not really thinking about a cohesive message and something that ties it all together. Starting with these basic statements, these central things, I think is very important for any pastor, but especially new pastors who are learning to write sermons.
Mm-hmm. And when you're working week after week in a congregation writing sermons, it's a very different experience than being the guest preacher, right? And I think a lot of people are listening that aren't ministers and have never had the task of preaching 30 or 40 times to the same group of people in a year, don't realize the amount of effort and energy that a good preacher puts into not just wrestling with the text and asking those theological questions, right? But underneath those three questions is you're also investing time in knowing the people, the community, the time in which you're preaching, the situation that you're in. Can you kind of share with people that have never had that task what it is their minister is likely putting into the whole process of crafting the sermon?
That's a great question, the process of creating a sermon. And it's different for every preacher. There's no set way that preachers do it. Some preachers will start to look at the text the day after, or maybe the afternoon after they preach their Sunday sermon, and say, okay, what's coming up? What am I going to be thinking about as I'm working on this sermon? And they're ruminating about this. They're maybe doing what's called lectio divina, which is to to listen to the text without any preconceived notions at first, just to see what words come out, what are the questions I have, and then to do some basic exegesis, which means to go to the biblical commentaries, reliable biblical commentaries, to see what have biblical scholars said about who this was addressed to, what was this community like, what was the author's intention, what are these images for example, and then with all of that in your mind, you're thinking, okay, so why would my congregation care about this? How does this apply to the lives of my particular group of people? And so then you're always, I mean, the thing to understand about preachers is you are always working on a sermon, always. When you're watching a movie, you're thinking about your sermon. When you're taking a walk, you're thinking about your sermon. When you're in a pastoral visit, it's always in the back of your mind. Maybe not consciously, but subconsciously, it's there because you've got this sort of radar up, thinking and looking for, oh, that's a great illustration, or ooh, that's a great story. That captures what I'm trying to say. And then you're working on your draft of how you want this to go. You know, all sermons have a beginning, a middle, and an end, so you have to think through just that basic thing, and then to be honing it, towards the end of the week, and then even sometimes the morning of, you're tweaking a little bit. You're thinking, this word isn't quite working, or this transition, it's not quite working right, and sometimes right at the last minute, you're making changes to try to hone the message of the sermon. Now, some pastors do it very differently. Some will work on their sermons and be thinking about a trajectory, especially if they're doing a sermon series. They do that a month ahead. We'll go on retreat for a day and just look at all the texts and sort of think through the arc of their message and do a lot of work at one time and kind of have it pretty much ready to go. Some people even back up earlier and think through a whole season of how they want to do the sermons for the season of Lent, for example. So, and then there are some pastors who, unfortunately, don't do a lot of prep and will, the night before, go on the internet and try to find some good stories and pull some things together and, throw it in and say, well, I got 10 minutes, I'm good. And it shows. And their parishioners are left homiletically hungry. So everybody does it differently.
Yeah, no, and I think maybe the best way to put this is, like, what are popular habits in the pulpit that if you could erase them or minimize them, you would? Like, when you think of preaching in America and in the West in general, what are the tendencies and habits that you think are impeding the church from really being addressed, affirmed, challenged, shook, woke by the gospel?
One of the things that we work on with our students is simply how to avoid bad theology. So when you think about the aphorisms or the pithy sayings that are out there in the culture, like God doesn't give you more than you can handle, or Jesus died for your sins, so everything's going to be okay, or God needed another angel in heaven, and that's why your loved one died.
Oh gosh, those are bad.
I know, but you would be surprised. Maybe you wouldn't be surprised how often people hear that in the pulpit, and so our first task is to, first of all, help our students understand what is appropriate, what are appropriate theological statements, what are strong, appropriate theological statements, and what are weak statements, and what are statements that we really need to avoid. Like, do you really believe this, is what we ask. Like, do you believe that God really took this child in order to have an angel? Like really think this through. It's almost like a theological laziness to rely on these cliches that do incredible harm to people's relationship with God. And so to really wrestle with what can we say about how God's heart is breaking in the midst of this, and that no, we do not understand this. It's not fair and it's not right. But where do we see God's Spirit and presence at work in the midst of this difficult time? That we see it in the midst of the church, that we see it in the bread and the wine, that we see it in the baptismal waters that wash over us continually. Finding the language and the imagery from Scripture to help us theologically and biblically frame these existential questions, these very deep questions about life and death and who we are and why we're here and who we're called to be. That's what we're looking for. We're looking for depth. We're looking for the pastor's heart and their authenticity and their honest wrestling with what the Scripture is saying, what it said back then and what it's saying now. That's what we're trying to cultivate in our students.
Mm-hmm. One of the things that strikes me about a lot of those kind of popular idioms is they're ultimately trivializing faith to be a therapeutic thing, where it's helping you kind of fit yourself to reality as it is, when the gospel is a lot about God's assessment of the world as it is and God's commitment and hope for the world as it can be and will be, right? And I think and you mentioned it earlier that part of good preaching is actually learning to think theological and then learning how to communicate it well. And in my experience, and I was in a congregation for 15 years, is when you ask lay people, like on searches or what they like, they say, "Oh, I want you to make it practical." And then if you ask them what times it's actually when you made it strange. And so, and I think there's something about, like, when you do theology well, when you engage the Scriptures well, it makes our world as we think it should be strange, right? Like habits that lead to the pillaging of the poor and the planet start to look strange as opposed to just normal, or patterns that are your normal in your family relationships that preserve resentment then get called out and brought to the fore. And so many of the text of Scripture, if you aren't immediately fitting them into something practical for the world as we already experience it, challenge it, and then it's actually calling something out of you as the preacher, but also out of the congregation. And I think so often we want to be practical, we want to be contemporary or relevant or whatever, and then we start getting rid of all the weird and strange things in the text and in the gospel that actually make it beautiful and make it compelling. And there's a reason people choose to show up. No one forces them. And if you're basically giving them Oprah with a Jesus stamp, or whatever whatever way of looking at life, then you're missing out on a very rich history and heritage and wisdom that's contained in these traditions and practices and rituals.
That's a great observation. And part of this is that there is a lot of theology out there that is giving, 5 steps to becoming prosperous in the Lord. The prosperity gospel, the preachers that are moralistic, like this is what you need to do in order to get into heaven. This is in the milieu. This is in the air that we breathe. So for pastors that are trying to be faithful to what the text actually says, and the way that the text challenges and forms the people in the way that God is calling them to be, rather than what the culture is trying to get them to be, there's this tension. And so what I have found is that there are ways to use that tension so that your congregation stays with you rather than resists you. Not to say that there won't be resistance, but in the book that I wrote, Preaching in the Purple Zone, one of the things that I try to help pastors recognize is that there's a dialogical quality to the preaching relationship with a congregation that we can use to our advantage, so that when a pastor wants to talk about this strangeness and the way that the Scripture confronts the normatizing of, like you said, the pillaging of the poor and the destruction of the environment, instead of it being a one-off prophetic sermon and thus saith the Lord, and sit down and that's it and off we go, but to invite people into a dialogue about it, to say, this is what I'm seeing, this is what we're seeing in the world, and yet the text says this. Isn't this interesting? What do we make of this? I wonder what insights we might gain from this. I wonder what was going on in the time of when Isaiah was writing, that they were confronting similar problems and insights that they got that might be helpful for us. So we're trying to make the case that Scripture not only authorizes us and permits us to talk about these difficult social issues, but actually compels us to go to these hot button topics in a way that says, I don't have all the answers, but I'm really interested in the questions. And I invite you to this dialogue so that we can talk about this and wrestle with this together and share our experiences and our perspectives. And then in a follow-up sermon to say, here's what we talked about. And here were things that people brought up. And here were some things that surprised me that I hadn't thought about before because I hadn't been listening in a way that was invitational, but I listened. And this is what I heard. And then to frame that dialogue, again, a theological and a scriptural way, to say, this is how God is working among us in the midst of this fractious and divisive time. I found that to be a very powerful method to help congregations engage with the biblical content.
Yeah, and the book, by the way, if someone didn't catch it, is called "Preaching in the Purple Zone," and in it, you develop that concept of deliberative dialogue. And one of the things I found really helpful about that is that, and this is definitely true for a lot of people once they leave seminary, right? Like, you go to seminary, you discover that Christianity is more hardcore than you thought, and now it's even more exciting. And there's actually things that are there that challenge the very problems you see facing the world. And you're like, you mean the church could have this on its missiological agenda? This is great. And then you go to a church and then you just go at them like someone told you to be the prophet, right? And so one of the things I find powerful about the book is it's saying, like, you can't leave those texts behind, but you also can't leave your congregation behind. So what does it mean to be a steward of the prophetic text? Because God hadn't called you to be the prophet. God's given us the gift of the prophets. And that also means putting yourself as the one being proclaimed at, right, from the prophets. And one of the images Brueggemann used on the podcast some point, and making a similar observation, and he goes, too many ministers confuse themselves with the prophets. You're their scribe. And a scribe has to learn how to write that text and perform that text and invite people in it. And when you're in a congregation and in a time that's as anxious as ours, in a congregation that can be divided, that deliberative dialogue, some could see it as delaying proclaiming whatever the issue is. But in a sense, it's insisting that even people that haven't thought about it, and those have thought a lot about it, or those that have, it affects them, and those that that it doesn't, all of them get their own experience and reflection on a particular topic is going to shape the way it gets heard in the congregation, right? And we're the people of God, but so often the way we function as ministers can elevate us as something other than the servant to the community. And then you get in that situation where the leader is so far ahead of their congregation, they can't tell the difference between you as an enemy or the one leading. And they start shooting at you.
Well, exactly. And what I try to explain to people is that simply naming and framing an issue in a biblical and theological way, and then inviting people into a dialogue about it, is itself a prophetic act, given the time that we're in. So right now, we're in a culture where it's either fight or flight. We're either demonizing people that we think are different from us ideologically and wanting to humiliate them and blast them on Twitter or whatever, or we don't want to deal with anything, and so we just pull back and because it's so overwhelming. So my goal is to try to help people thread the needle and find a way to engage on these very important issues that affect the people of God, and do it in a way that listens deeply to their experiences, their concerns, and takes seriously what our calling is as Christians, and then to discern what are values that we share, that even if we may disagree on immigration, for example, we can all agree that protecting children is important. Now, what that looks like for my conservative friend is different than what my progressive friend might say, but at least we can say protecting children is important. Okay, that's a place to start. And we're at the point now where the public square is it's like just crumbling and cracking around us. We just have to restore the public square. And I think the church is ideally situated to be one of the repairers of the breach, so to speak, and to start to say, here's how we can do this, that we can talk about these issues, convert people to one political side or the other. That's not the point. We have wisdom within our group that can help us discern how God is calling us to go. And once people engage in this process, and I've trained, oh my gosh, probably hundreds of people have gone through this through either my teaching them, and then they go out and teach it in their congregations. What people come away with is saying, oh, I didn't realize that we could actually talk about the opioid crisis in a way that we didn't end up hurting each other. So yeah, this was great. What else can we do? What else you got, Pastor? Let's do this some more. And it creates sort of an excitement and a regeneration of the prophetic conversation rather than just the prophetic proclamation.
Yeah, and because so often if it is that kind of one-way proclamation, then the real topic becomes their feelings and thoughts about you, and not about what it is that God's calling us to do and how to be faithful. And I think it's, part of the difficulty today is that the level of cultural anxiety is just so high that when you walk into a church, everyone's already near the edge of getting uncomfortable. And so sometimes what we're craving is this space where none of that's there, because we've never even had the experience of a group of people wrestling and reflecting and making decisions together that didn't escalate, right? And so one of the things that we did a similar process at a church I worked at, and the funniest comments to me were families like a month or two later that said, like, we managed to get through that awkward conversations in the church and then moved to action, that we decided we should probably try it at home, right? Wow. So like a lot of ministers will take personal anxiety that's coming from a culture you're not in charge of. And who knows how long that church has had that system of preserving these same relational dynamics. And so one of the gifts of a deliberative type of process that you described is you're letting people in their family systems, their church system, their work systems, and our larger cultural system have a moment where they can see that a different way is possible. And if in a sense, it's what is it like for us to at least look loving while we have those conversations, Right? When in the Gospel of John, Jesus says, "So like the whole like they'll know us by our love." Like that. Sometimes once we decide to be prophetic, we're the worst, and all of a sudden, someone is just their ideas or just their action in this one area of life, and then they are labeled, condemned, and dismissed. And Jesus, like Wilson said when he was on the podcast, was always trying to create back doors for even the Pharisees to sneak out of the death dealing system they're a part of.
Yeah, that's beautiful. Yeah, I mean, one of the things that I've found in this work is that that the people are hungering for opportunities to have these conversations. They may have some trepidation because of, like you said, past experiences in the congregation or histories of conflict, and that doesn't go away. But when we can create a space for people to articulate their, what has brought them to this place in their lives where they believe what they believe, and how do we help the church be the church in the midst of this time? It's sort of, everybody sort of exhales and says, "Oh, okay, this wasn't so bad. We can do this." I mean, I work with the Kettering Foundation, which is a nonprofit, nonpartisan group that researches how to help people have deliberative dialogues and to be better at democracy and be better citizens. And I'm part of a research group that says, how can we do this in houses of worship? And we developed an issue guide called "What is the Church's Role in a Divided Society?" And we have people in this issue guide think about 3 different approaches. Is the church more of a huge with public issues? And what are the upsides and what are the downsides of that? Is the church a mediator to help have these conversations? And what are the pros and the cons of that? Or is the church to be more of a prophetic voice? And what are the benefits and what are the drawbacks of that? And when you go through this process, you start to realize, okay, I may favor one of these approaches more than another, but the process challenges me to think of the intentions, but also maybe the unintended consequences, thus helping me to develop my critical thinking skills and helping me to listen to somebody else who's talking about this and say, "Oh, that's a good point. I hadn't thought about that before." Because again, we're not about demonizing. We're talking about ideas. We're not attacking people. And so this helps people to de-escalate those feelings of hurt and tension, and to really deal in a thoughtful way with the content.
So how do you, and you have an entire book on this, but when it goes to something like the ecological crisis, that at least the United States, like we're the only developed country with a political party that doesn't even understand the science, right? Like when it goes to an issue like that, I feel like there's a number of factors at play. That you get the partisan part at the cultural level, but you also get that's consistently been, at least in Los Angeles where I was a minister, listed on our young people in high school and college, like the main challenge they see facing the world. And then the church just says nothing about it. I mean, not like, because you don't want to offend and cause problems. And it's, to me, there's a sense that if the gospel doesn't have anything to say and call out of us when looking at the greatest crises we're facing today, then is it really good news? Right. Mm. And the first time I had a student in confirmation ask if I thought it was ethical to have children, knowing the long-term outlook and stuff, that kind of thing. It's like, I feel like, there are certain issues I get, like trying to manage and work through and help make progress and hold the door for people and all this kind of stuff. But then when it's one that's dealing with grandkids being able to breathe, like I feel like it just should be different. And then I also know the social psychic reasons why if you act that way, it doesn't actually help change anyone's mind. Right. So, and I know that technically I might shop at a little different place and consume different things at a slightly different rate, but ultimately we're probably, even the person I'm condemning, contributing at about the same rate to the overall problem. And we neither can imagine a world in which our life looks anything like it does if we opt out of a constant growing economy where so much consumption, coalesces at the top. Right. So it's one of those difficult topics, but I just don't even know what to do with it. And it just gets exhausting and it can get overwhelming. And then you can imagine why a progressive church would say, well, let's just talk about including people. Because that doesn't cost us anything, and we just start to include people into the system as it is, but we don't want to change the system. That's called the ecology kind of demands that. And then certain people won't come to our church because we got a rainbow flag out front, and we don't even have to see any Rush Limbaugh fans. This is great. Well, there's no Fox News viewers. Don't go to church here because we accept everybody. And I don't know what to do with that situation because I actually know I feel better when I don't have to see certain individuals that represent certain things to me. And then I say to myself, Tripp, you're a judgmental POS. And I go, I am, but I was more comfortable. And do I really want them teaching my kids Sunday school? Right. And I know if I'm thinking this, I'm not the only one.
You're definitely not the only one. Yeah. Well, I wonder if this coronavirus pandemic is going to shift how we talk about environmental issues in the long run, the kind of massive changes in a system that are necessary to deal with a crisis. Now, obviously, there are huge differences between a viral pandemic and the climate crisis, because the climate crisis, while it is arguably killing more people just through air pollution alone, while it is killing more people, it is happening at a more of a slow boil. So it's like the frog in the pot that doesn't jump out because the water is getting slowly hotter until it boils to death. It's moving at a slower pace, whereas the virus is mutating constantly and just finding ways to infect. And so we're having to take drastic measures such as social distancing. But what I'm wondering, what I think will be very interesting to see is if people realize, we didn't have to fly to do this meeting. We didn't have to go out and consume for 3 weeks or however many, I'm not saying that there is not serious suffering that is happening because of the virus. I'm not trying to downplay that. What I'm saying is that we are being forced into a different way of life that none of us have ever had to experience before. And while some of us are going to be, there's incredible anxiety about it, we may also see that, it is possible. It is possible to do these system-wide changes that will benefit the entire population. So can we take the lessons from the coronavirus pandemic and translate them to the climate crisis? I'm hoping that we can. I don't know. It may be that once this all blows through, it'll just be this huge revelry and people will just, start partying like it's 1999. So we might have this sort of bounce back effect and people just go crazy. I'm hoping and praying, and I'll be preaching about the opposite, to say, see, here's how God was working in the midst of this. And wasn't there something beautiful about the way people slowed down a little bit and reached out to their neighbors? And yes, there were also people that tried to capitalize on it and did not respond in an appropriate way. But we saw something different here. And how did God use this time of disruption to make it a holy disruption rather than a death-dealing one? And can we apply those same lessons to the climate crisis?
No, I think that's really important. And one thing that reminded me of is just the other day I was talking with my son who's 12, and this is his first big experience where he's like coming of age, and then obviously worrying about something, but also wanting to know what to do and all that kind of things. And he said, "Dad, there's a number of people I know at church who are elderly and live alone. We should just make sure someone goes to get their food so they don't have to go out in public." Right.
Yeah, that's beautiful.
And it is, but I also think like if we start listening, we may even have solutions coming from people who whose imagination has not been occupied by what's already allowable. Right. Like in his mind, he's hearing the data goes like, well, what if we did this? And he's like, it wouldn't be that hard if we took all of our bags to get a couple of people's groceries for them and drop it off. Right. Like, and I just think that was true when I was a minister, that regularly students or people that are new to the faith that this is their first time being a member of a church or stuff will give ideas that are really obvious and not that complicated that make a huge difference. But you don't know it because you've been in a church for a long time and you work there and you understand that what a church really wants is probably what it already has, with something good to point at, right? And I think this challenge is forcing so many churches to figure out how to have community now that we actually have to figure out how to do it using technology and social media and stuff. And what is it like to actually engage? What is it like to prepare a sermon when you realize large numbers of your friends online who do not go to your church might watch it?
Mm-hmm.
Like, that's a different thing. I sit there thinking, now, I mean, obviously I put myself on the internet every week, but usually it's so nerdy. My friends only listen once if they aren't actually into theology and philosophy and stuff. But if I was preaching, I know quite a few of them that have, when I'm guest preaching at a church and they stream it, will then like comment to me later that they watched my sermon. And I'm like, oh,
did I say anything untoward?
Yeah.
I think we have to be expansive in our thinking and also very particular. It's a very interesting phenomenon where, because church, we've always expected people to come to church. And that's been a huge downfall, I think, for being the church, because of course, Jesus and the disciples went out to people. They didn't make them come to a building. So now we're in a situation where they're literally not allowed to go to church. So how can you be church and not shame people and not endanger people and really listen to what the needs are? I mean, I love what your son said. That's one of the reasons why I say the youth are not the future of the church. They're the church right now. They have things, they have a different perspective. They have a different thought pattern that was not formed in the way ours was formed, that gives them insight. Not to say that they don't also get value from learning the traditions of the church. Obviously, I think that's important because that's what I teach. But I have children too. I have a 13-year-old and a 16-year-old. And we're always in conversation about what are their choices going forward as people of faith, knowing what they know about the world. What are the ethical and moral implications of their career choices and their choice of a life partner who may or may not want to have a biological child? And how are they going to work that out if they fall in love with somebody who really wants a biological child, but the other person says, I can't do this. I want us to adopt. Can we do that? I mean, these are questions and decisions that our generation just didn't have to deal with on this scale. So the church can help people have these ethical and moral discussions. We can give them templates to be able to set these questions on and say, all right, let's think about this in a way that's going to really help guide me in how I live my life as a Christian or as a person of faith in a world that is changing constantly. What are the constants of the teachings, the values of the church that can guide us going forward?
Mm-hmm. Yeah, one of the things that that made me think of is how many times I heard, well, we don't do it that way, or we've never tried that before, and that kind of thing in a congregation. After they've all figured out how to be online for the next few months, I really feel like that excuse isn't going to work as well, right?
It's not.
And why did you decide we're going to spend a few days figuring out how to do something we've never done before? Is because you actually think that what's at the heart of the community you're serving matters, right? And for so long, the church has lived on the inertia of Christendom.
Yes.
It's lived where who is it in every denomination that ends up in charge? It's usually the ones that were born into it, loved that denomination, went to all their camps, probably went to one of their schools, and we're so pumped to serve the biggest church that is the few of the big and the healthy ones in it. And then they get promoted in it, right? And so they go to a church that wants what they've already been given, kind of thing. But most people's churches aren't like that, and most people's experiences with religion don't fit that way. And I think we need to have congregations and have leaders where the incentives aren't to give the growing or the shrinking number of people the 1950s church experience. And there's so many different challenges to it, and one like that you've been hinting at are the forms and stuff. But the other question that I'd love to hear is from you is, how do you think differently about the content of preaching when you can't assume the congregants are familiar with even the biblical story, or that certain theological idioms are actually horrible theology, and those type of things? Like how does the task of a preacher to a congregation who's more and more post-Christian culturally change?
That's a great question. And I actually was already talking to my students about this very question, about how do you talk about how do you avoid the jargon that we are so used to in the church and the formulaic phrases that people assent to, sort of nod their heads when they hear it. Jesus died for your sins. That just comes up over and over again. Jesus died on the cross for you. And that's so I always say to them, okay, now imagine somebody comes into your church for the first time, has never been exposed to Christianity, and they hear you say this. How are they going to respond? And unfortunately, most of them say, a visitor would come to my church? What? I mean, a lot of them say it's the same old group. I don't have to think about these questions. And now I can actually say to them, nope, that excuse is not going to work anymore. And honestly, it didn't work before, because even if you have people who have been brought up in the faith, baptized, confirmed, married, served on the council, that sort of thing, chances are they don't understand what that concept truly means either. So you have to find a way to say what you're trying to say without using the jargon. Strip the jargon away and find the words that truly speak the theological truth that you're trying to get at, whether that's through a narrative, whether that's through poetry, whether that's through really plain words that make it clear what you're talking about. Do not assume that people know anything about Jesus. Don't assume that they know what dying on the cross means. Like, what does that even mean for somebody who's never been in a church and has never been but what does that mean? You have to find a way to say it differently so that other people are going to understand. And we have examples of that all throughout Acts when Paul was at the Areopagus, and what he used the stories that the people were already familiar with, but then also pointed to, here's your unknown God, right? You've got mystery here. Well, let me share with you about this unknown God. And so took what they knew and then took them to the next level. That's what our challenge is going forward.
No, that's super helpful. Super helpful. So thank you for hanging out on the internet and talking about quite a few different topics. For everyone that is looking into theological education, make sure you check out Lexington Theological Seminary. And the book that we were discussing but didn't mention is Creation Crisis Preaching. And it's definitely worth checking out as well. In particular, some really cool advice on introducing eco-feminist themes around other doctrines than creation, so that the other doctrines are also reinforcing a deep creation narrative. And then she has this brilliant chapter on the notion of the trickster and preaching Easter that is just so good that hopefully we'll get to talk again so we can talk about that more specifically.
I'd love that.
The other half of my questions I haven't got to, but that just means we were having fun.
Rooted in Rising, Voices of Courage in a Time of Climate Crisis. And I would definitely love to have just a green conversation with you next time around.
Awesome.